Welcome to our series on learning, writing, and getting published with New York Times bestselling author of fiction and nonfiction, George Galdorisi. This is Lesson 2, where we build on Lesson 1 and go deeper into the process. I met with George in his Coronado home where we discussed his process of writing. Right then and there, we decided to do a 6-episode series to help aspiring authors learn, write, and get published. Let's join George now in this episode 2. And welcome back to the Admiral's Almanac special series on writing. We continue our journey with this episode being lesson number 2. I'm your host, Gary Hall, and again, I'm in Coronado with our guide in this process, New York Times bestselling author, George Galdorisi. Good morning, George. Let's continue our series on writing and getting published. How are you this morning?
Doing great, Gary. Thanks for having me on the podcast, as always. And I appreciate the opportunity to pay it forward and share what I've learned along the way and how my mentors have helped me with my writing journey with your listeners.
And I want to remind our listeners to go to www.georgegaldorisi.com, and you can navigate his website and find the PowerPoint slides that go along with this series. And to recap, on Series 1, we talked about just start writing. Start writing what you're passionate about. Start writing with expertise gained through a good reference library, and how to write short pieces and how to, get in journals or magazine articles, and maybe even just personal journaling of your life for a piece to give down to your children, grandchildren, etc. But in this episode, George, why don't we dive deeper into this process and give us action items to get ready and get down and get writing? What do you think about that?
Yeah, let's do it. I think going upstream, just repeating from the previous podcast, most of us are best served if we write something that we're passionate about. And it doesn't have to stop with one article. So what most of us do is write about things we're passionate about and repurpose that material. And what I mean by that, I'll give an example of a fellow, former helicopter pilot, Mark Liebman, who's a very accomplished skier. And so he'll write an article in one ski magazine about a particular hill at a particular ski resort that he did. And then he'll write another article for another ski magazine that doesn't exactly repeat what he wrote in the first one, but takes the same experience and talks about it again. And most of us who are passionate about something seek more than one outlet for what they write. And again, the more you write about it, the easier it is to write because you're not having to put an enormous amount of thought into it. And then the other thing that people sometimes do is they'll have to decide whether to write by themselves or write it with a wingman. You'll see a lot of articles in journals and online media where two people are collaborating. And again, that's something where it's kind of like marriage. You want to be compatible, but sometimes it brings more to the article if you're doing it with someone else.
Exactly. And the fact that repurposing is your example of 2 different ski magazines. Most readers probably only subscribe or only read one of the 2 magazines. So you're connecting with a second audience by repurposing. And so basically you have a framework and just add the specifics to the second story.
Right. But the first one's the most important one. So, let's say you write an article for a particular ski magazine, and then a couple of months later, you query the editor of another ski magazine. And you say, I saw an article in your magazine about skiing in Vail. I have a different experience, and talk about what you want to write about. And I've also published articles in this other ski magazine. I'm not a skier, so I don't have the names of them. But that tells that editor, oh, well, what you wrote got published, so probably going to be good stuff that you send me. So it's a lot of salesmanship, but you're really wanting them to say, it's kind of like the book Getting to Yes. You want them to say, yes, please submit.
Yeah, and I think, as you said, you can write something and nobody's going to find it. This is not build it and they will come. You've got to be out there and be your own advocate and be your own publicist. Wouldn't you agree to that? That you've got to tell your story about your story?
Exactly. And it is selling your story, because if you write an article for a magazine and it's not very good, well, your best friends may make fun of you, but if the editor publishes something that you wrote that's not very good, the editor might not be the editor anymore. So you can call them the speed bumps or the gatekeepers, but again, they want to make sure that what they publish is quality. So they're there to help you.
All right. So again, just start writing, write something you're passionate about, get feedback from maybe friends and family, maybe not your spouse. I only say that because you don't want to start that process of having your spouse edit your work unless they're a professional. They might have too much personal information. Anyway, I digress. Keep writing, improving, submit, and then repurpose that information. And you got to promote yourself. Are there ways to promote yourself, George?
Yeah, I think you want to be able to convince the editor that you know what you're talking about. I'll give you an example. A student in one of my seminars was a very avid sailor, and he actually took people on sailing trips in the Virgin Islands. So, when he teed up his query to the editor, he said, first of all, he pointed out he read that magazine. In this case, it was called Sail. He talked, it may sound a little self-promoting, but that's what you need to do. He said he's enjoyed reading Sail and how the magazine has featured articles about sailing in the Caribbean. And then he points out that he was a skipper of a sailboat, took people on trips in the Virgin Islands, that he made money doing that. And then, he teed up the name of the article, 10 Secret Coves of the Virgin Islands, and asked him if he would be interested in that article. He pointed out that he knew how many words were required by that magazine. He said he could send photographs. And so, it hooked the editor into saying, yeah, I'd love to read your article. Not an absolute promise it would be published, but enough of an invitation that he could send it in.
Okay, so yeah, you've got to promote yourself. What other resources? Should we set up a website, a blog, or using social media? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, that question always comes up, and it's always a trade-off, because people can spend an enormous amount of time on setting up a website, populating a website, going on X and Facebook and other places to promote. But while you're doing that, you're not writing. So it really is a balance that there's no easy answer. There's no point solution, but you've got to try it out and see what works for you. But to your point, yeah, if you want to write and want to be noticed, then you almost always have to have a website where you put all your articles on the website. So again, using my friend who had the sailing business, let's say he writes 5 articles for various sailing magazines about some aspect of sailing. Well, when he queries an editor again, then he'll pitch the editor and he'll put a link to his website and say, you can see some of the articles I've done for other sailing magazines. And believe me, there are scores of sailing magazines out there, so there's no limit to how many articles you can publish.
In your analogy or example of writing for a sailing magazine and querying the editor, is there a special way you should write your letter? I think we mentioned once before about keywords and things of that nature.
Yeah, well, in that example I just gave about the gent who had the sailboat, and again, it was one of my seminars, and I learned a lot from him because he's published a lot of articles on sailing. The keywords are showing you've read the magazine and being, honest about that. Telling that you've got some expertise in that area. So you're a subject matter expert about sailing. You're not just some yokel who decides he wants to write an article about sailing, that you've written other articles on sailing before, that you understand what this editor's requirements are as far as how many words, does he want pictures, those kinds of things. So yeah, those are the key words that you're saying. this is going to be easy. I've written before, so you're not saying it specifically, but you're saying you're probably not going to edit my stuff a lot. And I'm going to have pictures available for you. And I know how long the article should be. So if the sweet spot is 1,500 words, you're not going to give them a 5,000 word article. So yeah, it's making him say, yeah, this is going to be an easy day reading this article.
So essentially, when it comes to keywords, you've got to make sure you've done your homework, your research, and so that you sound like an authority, or that you have become an authority on the magazine you're writing with. But also, you need to build those relationships with those in charge of bringing in articles, editors, etc. So can we go a little bit, we mentioned that once before in a previous episode, but can we go into depth on how have you built relationships with editors?
It's first of all, doing an article that they like and they accept. And then you're a known quantity with them, so you can query and say, I see over the past several months that you've published several articles on artificial intelligence. I have an idea for an article on artificial intelligence based on what I do in my day job or what I've learned in a course. And it would look something like this. Would this interest you? And that's all you have to do. And then you throw it over the transom. And if they say, not that interested, you say, okay. And then a week later, 2 weeks later, you come up with a different idea. But having that relationship where you feel comfortable communicating with the editor and asking if he or she will be interested in something saves you a whole lot of work that, you would waste time writing a 2,000 word article that no one's interested in.
And once you've built that relationship, have you had experiences where editors come back to you and say, hey, George, this is what's going on in the world. Can you give us a piece on a current event?
Sure. I'll use the example of the Naval Institute proceedings, which I've written for decades. For instance, they'll have themes. They'll have a Marine Corps theme one month, or a Naval Aviation theme, or a Coast Guard theme. And those come with a particular battle rhythm. You know which month those things are going to be in. So you query the editor and say, I see the naval aviation issues coming up soon. Have you got too many articles on unmanned aerial vehicles? Conversely, they'll come back to you and say things like, we're a little thin on articles about the Marine Corps. We like people who've served in the amphibious assault Navy to do an article. Would you consider doing an article on the Marine Corps' latest amphibious flagship kinds of things? So that's the relationship where they know they can count on you and you're a known quantity.
Yes. And people may come to you once you've established your reputation to write op-ed pieces that promote their perspective. Is that normal, ethical? Are your thoughts on that, where you're actually being compensated to write with your expertise, and which promotes an industry's perspective?
Yeah. So first off, that's a great question. The overwhelming majority of professional journals and trade journals don't pay for articles. They're just giving you a chance to share your ideas. And the ones that do pay, you're not going to get rich doing that. Naval Institute Proceedings, for example, pays a couple $100 for an article. But I think that's not why most of us write. We write because we have a point of view and something we want to share. As far as, the journal's point of view, whether it's one or the other side of the political spectrum, I guess putting it in familiar political terms, there are dozens of think tanks in the United States, and many of them are either liberal or conservative. So, you just are not going to write a conservative article for an extremely liberal think tank's newsletter. So I think you're just picking your spots where the article would be welcome, kind of thing. So yeah, I hope that answers the question, but it's not really Machiavellian. It's like, well, they would want to hear from me, as opposed to these people don't want to hear from me because my point of view is exactly 180 out from theirs.
So that also goes to the point of knowing your audience, who, you've got your passion, you've got to know your audience, and then find the outlets for that audience and that passion. So, and I think, as my father-in-law used to say, when somebody hesitated to take action, what are they going to do? Punch you? So an editor isn't going to reach through the phone or reach through the email and punch you. They'll just say, no, thank you, or yes, send us a sample. So don't be afraid that you're just starting out, and you might find out that, hey, you are a pretty good writer after all. And so once you've got that first piece or that second piece going, can't you build on that? Let's go a little bit deeper into repurposing and building content, George.
Yeah, so I'll give you a couple examples. First of all, when Becky and I lived in Virginia Beach, we had a realtor friend who was just starting out in the realty business. And she found a way to write content, good content, for various realtor magazines. And it wasn't about her selling homes. It was about what she knew about the market, about the history of homes in a particular neighborhood. And people got to read that and say, oh, she seems like a really sensible person. And after doing that for a while, it started to generate business without her paying for ads or those sorts of things. So she self-promoted, and she built up expertise as someone who knew a lot about buying and selling homes. You know, for my journey as a helicopter pilot and who was privileged to serve in the Lamps Mark III community starting back in the 80s, I did lots and lots of articles about Lamps Mark III, basically, you know, because I was enthusiastic about it. I was passionate about it and wanted other people to know about the qualities that the SH60B brought to the fore. And then I did articles about that. A gentleman named Tom Phillips, who's passed away, did articles in some of the same journals. And that's how we eventually came together and decided we would write a book together called Leave No Man Behind, about combat search and rescue. Another example is I did articles about the Law of the Sea Convention, which just taking this back a little bit without giving you all the gory details, for most of recorded history, different nations had different ideas about which waters were theirs, which waters were international waters, et cetera, et cetera. So in 1982, the United Nations called a convention together, had over 150 nations to participate, to harmonize that, to say the territorial sea is 12 miles, the continental shelf is 200 miles, et cetera. And sadly, the United States didn't ratify the convention for various reasons. So I and others like Gary, like your classmate, Jim Stavridis, wrote articles in professional journals saying, no, this is dumber than dirt. We ought to ratify this. And again, did articles on that for many years. And that eventually led to a book where I had most of the grist that I needed for the book through those articles.
Yeah. So you might have a book in mind. You might want to write a book, but start small, because we want to do the crawl, walk, run method. And you realize that once you have a bunch of small articles written, it may lead to that book.
Yeah. And again, there's non-quantifiable things that happen because of this. First of all, you're recognized as an expert in your field, and other people reach out to you and say, well, I have similar interests. Let's talk. And that's kind of human nature, is to get people who are interested in what you're interested in and have a dialogue with them. You get invitations once you're noticed as noted as an expert to present your material at conferences and symposia. You sometimes get invitations to teach or collaborate or do a portion of a book on a subject. And I think I did probably 40 articles on Law of the Sea before I attempted a book. And again, to use a very common contemporary term, all of this contributes to building your brand. You know, you're the guy or gal who knows a hell of a lot about this subject.
Exactly. Now, we've mentioned that you can get the slides that go along with these talks on www.georgegaldorisi.com. But also, I want to reiterate that George, along with a colleague, Kevin McDonald, wrote a book called Brave Ship Writers Share Their Secrets: How to Write a Book People Want to Read. And that's available as a paperback or an ebook. And I think if you're listening to this podcast, you might as well spend the dollars to grab that book, and so you can highlight, scribble in it, and dog ear it, and help you know the secrets to writing a book that will get published. So, and you wrote that book with Kevin McDonald.
Right.
So should you think about writing solo or with a wingman?
Yeah, that's a great question, Gary. And I think so some people are introverts, some people are extroverts. Some people just prefer doing it by themselves. Some people understand that different points of view or different approaches sometimes combine to make the product better. So I think the first thing when you're thinking about that is having a wingman is, does someone else share your passion about this subject? For Kevin and I on the book you mentioned, we both have written fiction and nonfiction. We both have done seminars and given writing advice. So it's like, yeah, we need to tell people about this. And that's what germinated into the book. And then it's, who does what best? And I'll give you an example. Dick Couch and I collaborated on several books. The first one was Act of Valor, which was the novelization of the SEAL movie that many people know about. It was the #1 top grossing movie in 2012. And we're different. I'm the guy who listened to his third grade teacher and, likes doing the outline and getting it all organized. And again, in our world, Gary, having a NATOPS checklist. And Dick just likes to write. So, as a division of labor, that worked perfectly for us, where I did all the outlining and the sort of the NATOPS checklist stuff. And Dick produced more of the prose because that's what he loved doing. So again, that's what you want to find in a partner, that you're compatible, just like marriage.
And I think that thought works in marriage, works in business, works in leadership. You need to do a little introspection and what are you good at? And then what are your weaknesses and how do you find somebody that can fill in the blanks where you are weak? So, there's that old saying that if you want to write, just cut open a vein and bleed. But really, this can be done by anyone using a checklist, like you mentioned, NATOPS, which is our Naval Aviation Bible, if you will, on procedures, techniques, and systems. So we're checklist oriented, but that works. So you don't have to cut open a vein and bleed. You don't have to go up to a cabin. Just sit down and write what you're passionate about. So how do we ensure that what we produce is embraced and accepted?
Yeah, well, like I said, I think if you're passionate about it, that's going to come through in your writing, and it's going to be exciting and engaging. And an editor is going to go, "Yeah, I think I'd like to do that." And again, editors, regardless of what they edit, are people who love the English language. So there are tactics, techniques, and procedures that you can do to make sure what you write is accepted. So you passionately write a 1,000-word article. You look at it and you say, oh, this is great, this sings. Well, then you need to exploit Microsoft Word and make sure you've spelled all the words right. Make sure that the grammar is correct. And there's so many tools online that you can use that you can do your own editing before you throw it over the transom. And again, having people who you trust and are friends, probably not your spouse, that you can send them your article and say, hey, give me your feedback on this. And they will. Most friends will do that, and they will pull punches. But yeah, I think it sounds corny, but just going back to all the things that we learned in school and outlining, if that's something you're comfortable with before you write, is always, you won't get writer's block. You'll just know that you need to march along to the next steps.
And I think outlining doesn't have to be detailed outlining. You can start just by going, all right, here's the 10 topics I want to cover in this book, and then go from there. In fact, when I was writing Navigating Leadership, Making a Pact with Excellence, available on Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com, shameless plug, I was told, don't share it with friends. Share it with people that aren't that close to you, because then they'll give you an unbiased opinion. So if that's feasible, share it. Also, there's the capability of the website Fiverr, Fivver, where people will do editing, grammar, etc., for you for a low price. But Kindle or Amazon and Kindle direct publishing has changed the writing environment. And so I would say maybe 70% of the books on Amazon may be self-published and are really terrible because the author did their own editing, their own spell checking and things of that nature. When you really need a team, don't you think, George, to get a book that is, or an article that is polished?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's talk about that, Gary, for a second, because 20 years ago, if someone self-published a book, they went to some place that did it for them, and that was called, and it wasn't a term of endearment, that was called Vanity Press. And that, boy, there's a book and it's got my name on it. That has changed dramatically over the years, and now there are self-published books that actually are very worthy. There's a woman, Colleen Hoover, who self-published her books online. They did fabulously well, and a publisher found her, and now she's literally making millions of dollars writing. Having said that, you have to be everything to everybody if you decide to self-publish a book. And I'll give you an example, because I've done it both ways. When you work with a publisher, and my co-author and I, Sam Tangretti, are working with the Naval Institute now on a book that'll be out this spring called Algorithms of Armageddon. And it's all about what happens when you put AI in military systems. But here's what you get when you're working with a publisher. First of all, you're going to send them a treatment and narrative outline, and they're going to decide whether this is worthy of a book. And it may not be. Your idea may be flimsy enough that it's only an article and not a book. Then you get editorial comments and vectors on your in-progress manuscript. Then you get a detailed editorial review on your first cut at the manuscript, and then you get more editorial reviews. Then you get a copy editor who is a person who knows more about the English language than your best English teacher ever, who makes sure that the punctuation and the grammar and everything is perfect. And then you get an in-house editor's final review, and then you have a publisher's distribution network. So you get a lot with a publisher. You don't get as much money as if you self-publish and sold the same number of books, but having a publisher make sure that your book gets distributed, et cetera. So it's a huge trade-off, but the point I'm trying to make is that if you self-publish, you have to do all of those things I mentioned yourself, and you have to do them really, really well. So I advise people, swing for the fences. Try to get it published, query every agent, every publishing house you can. And if it's still no, then if you want to see those words in print, you can self-publish.
Now, once before, I think several podcasts ago, you talked about finding a publisher. Can you talk a little bit about that? About, you've got an idea how you found a publisher, how you recommend finding a publisher.
Yeah. Well, and again, taking it back a ways, the publishing industry has contracted massively. And most publishers will tell you that, you can thank Jeff Bezos for that and Amazon. But the point is, there are only 5 big publishing houses now, and they've contracted. So the 23-year-old intern they had from Duke who would go through all the manuscripts ever sent to that publisher doesn't exist anymore. So they don't take unsolicited manuscripts. So they depend on agents, literary agents, to be their speed bump, to be their guard. And so the advice I give most people is don't even think about submitting to a publisher, submit to an agent. And then to answer your question directly, Gary, how do you find the right agent? Because there's thousands of agents out there. Take your idea for your book, go to the library and find books like yours. And then most writers are courteous enough to thank their agent and the acknowledgments. And then there's another book in the library that lists all the agents in the United States and their contact info. And then you direct your query at those few agents and say, "Dear Johnny Jones, I see that you were the agent for Sammy Smith's book, Murder in Washington, D.C. I have a book of the same genre, Murder in the Pentagon, that's based on recently unclassified information, et cetera, et cetera." And now you're basically showing him you did your due diligence, and your book is the kind of book he likes the agent, because most agents don't take everything. They'll stand up at a writing seminar and say, I'm interested in young adult fiction and romance and post-apocalyptic novels. That's it. So that's how you find the right agents and don't exhaust yourself sending queries to hundreds and hundreds of agents.
Yes. And again, you can do this. If you're listening to this, you can write, get published. I think of one of my squadron pilots whose wife started using pilots in our squadrons and writing romance novels, and she's a best-selling romance novelist now. So you can do this. So, George, why don't we wrap up this session? And so, can you give us a homework assignment for people that have listened to the first and second, and maybe listened to our episode on Brave Ship Writers Share Their Secrets, how to write a book people want to read, again, available on Amazon.com. What can we do to get people to put pen to paper, pencil to paper, or fingers to keyboard? Give us an assignment.
Yeah. So again, just understand this is in our DNA, and it's not something that only a few special people do. So the assignment would be just sit down and go through those kind of bullets we talked about earlier about, what is it that you're passionate about? And what is it that when you're at the bar talking with your friends, what you want to talk about? And what do you wish you had more time for? And if someone said you have a year to do nothing else except this, what would this be? Maybe it's sailing. Maybe it's hiking the Appalachian Trail. So those are the things that you want to think about when you write. Talk about what issues concern you, whether it's political or military or climate change, and think about the things you have done in your life that people seem curious about or ask you for advice about. I've got a good friend, another helicopter aviator who knows more about the financial world than probably Kramer on TV. So, people are always asking for advice. So those are that's the grist that helps you pick what you want to write about.
Super. And so just get out there and write, and don't say, okay, boomer, you did it. I can't. Whether it's you're writing notes in your notes app on your iPhone, or writing in a 3x5 cards or on your keyboard, just get out there and write. And my assignment would be, why don't you go listen to some David Sedaris, who writes essays, and find out that he gets all his material, he starts writing into a small notebook that fits in the back of his back pocket. So listen to David Sedaris, and I think you'll get some chuckles out of that. And George, what can we look forward to maybe the next episode of writing and getting published?
Yeah, so I think where we're going to go next, Gary, is talking about it's kind of the big fork in the road when people decide to write. Are they going to write nonfiction or fiction? And again, without overselling nonfiction, if you go to your local bookstore, you'll see there are probably 4 or 5 times as many shelves holding nonfiction books than books that are novels. The other thing about nonfiction we'll talk about is how, as opposed to having to produce the entire book and then try to sell it, you can write a proposal that's very short and see if a publisher or an agent will bite on that. So it's a lot more success-oriented path. So we'll talk about those, particularly in the nonfiction world, and our next episode. And I look forward to let me share that with your listeners. And just one last thing, you don't mind a quote, because we talked about writing and being passionate and then making sure what you write is quality. Sean Connery once said, you write the first draft with your heart and you rewrite it with your head. The first key to writing is to write, not to think. So again, get it down on paper, step away from it for a couple of days and go back and say, okay, how can I make this really sing?
Awesome advice, George. Again, we're here with George Galdorisi, New York Times bestselling author. His website is www.georgegaldorisi.com. Mine is www.admiralsalmanac.com. And again, click on the microphone in the lower right-hand corner where you can send us a voicemail and we can answer your questions in a future episode. So again, George's latest book is Brave Ship Writers Share Their Secrets, How to Write a Book People Want to Read. Again, thank you. And until we meet the next time, here's wishing you a happy voyage home. Thank you for joining George Galdorisi and me in this 6-episode series on learning, writing, and getting published. Follow the Admiral's Almanac on Apple Podcasts or wherever quality podcasts are available. You just finished episode 2 in this series. Look for our next episode for lesson 3. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Admiral's Almanac. Please share with your family and friends. I'm your host, retired Rear Admiral Gary Hall, author of the best-selling book, Navigating Leadership, Making a Pact with Excellence, available on Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com. It's the perfect gift for the leaders in your life. Pick up your copy today. Follow the Admiral's Almanac wherever quality podcasts are hosted, and reach out to me if you'd like a keynote speaker at your next event or want personal coaching on your career goals. Again, thanks for listening to this episode of the Admiral's Almanac. As we say in the Navy, here's wishing you a happy voyage home. Until we meet again, I'm Rear Admiral Gary Hall.